I'm Johanna, I'm the Talks programmer at the Photographers Gallery. And this is the second part of our series here at the Architectural Association during our major redevelopment program at our building on Ramillies Street. So before we start, I've got a couple of slightly boring housekeeping notes. As some of you will know, the Architectural Association record these talks, and so if you could just double make sure that you've switched off your mobile phones, just because they'll interfere with the signal of the recording. And I think, although we're quite relaxed at the Photographers Gallery, I think tonight what we'll do, since there's so many of you here, is we'll leave the comments or questions or any kind of points towards the end of the talk, I think might be best. So really it's just thank you very much to the Architectural Association and Beatriz for coming here. As you know, Beatriz is Professor of Architecture and Founding Director of the Program in Media and Modernity at Princeton University. And we're very pleased that she's here to join us this evening for her lecture, Double Exposure, Architecture as a Machine to See. So thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm really very happy to be part of this is working. That's why. It's not working. Okay, let's see. Now, I try again. Okay, is it working now? So I'm really happy. Thank you very much for coming. I'm very happy to be part of this series on photography and architecture. And I have chosen, as you may have understood by the little poster, to talk about the work of Dan Graham, and in particular about his pavilions in relation to the long and interesting history of pavilions in modern architecture, that are not only among the most kind of radical experiments of the last century, but also, for the most part, since they tend to disappear, we only know them in photography. So, and I think also that this is actually, when I was thinking about this talk today, that this is not at all accidental, that the fleeting nature of pavilions goes precisely to the heart of photography with its attempt to capture the fleeting moment. Pavilions then are, in a way, intimately tied to photography. And indeed, what might make the pavilions of Dan Graham so special is that pavilions in his work is that he seems to invite us inside the pavilion as if he was into a camera, into the camera itself, that little kind of room designed only to capture an image. And to start with, I wanted to tell you a story. It's a story from the 1940s, a story of Anaïs called The Veiled Woman. And this is a story where there is a man called George that is in a bar, and in the bar he sees this very stylish couple all dressed in black, and the woman has a veil covering her face. And then the woman leaves the bar, and then the man comes to George, to the first man, and tells him that he's completely dominated by the caprices of this woman, that he's only interested in a man that they had never seen before, and that he will never see him again. And then he offers George to pay him $50 to satisfy the desire of the desires of this woman. Then he accepts. The story is a little bit more elaborate, but I'm kind of shortening it for you. He accepts and then gets into a taxi and is kind of blindfolded so that he doesn't know where he's going, and eventually arrives at a house with all white walls and mirrors, and everything is white, and there are many mirror walls, so that he loses every sense of perspective, seeing only the infinite repetitions of himself making passionate love to this woman. For months, he's completely haunted by the memory of this extraordinary experience, until one evening he's again in a bar, and then another man comes to tell him a story. And the story is that several months before, this second man says that he was in a bar, and an elegantly dressed man had approached him and offered for a fee of $100 to let him see a magnificent love scene. So when the first man, George, asked him to describe the scene, he then recognized himself in the very scene he had participated in. I'm telling you this story because the structure of this Anaïs, as I say, 1940s story, I think in many ways echoes the optical and even psychological structure of the pavilions of Dan Graham. Because unlike traditional artworks, both viewer and performers in Dan Graham's pavilion are invited to participate in a game in which their roles are unexpectedly reversed several times, and with mirrors intensifying both the exposure and the concealment. Think, for example, about the first pavilion of Dan Graham. This is public space, 2 audiences, a pavilion that he did for the 1976 Venice Biennale Ambiente, organized by Germano Celan, where a room, as you can see in the drawing, in the shape of a golden rectangle, was divided into square rooms by a soundproof glass wall, and one of the walls was mirror at the end, right? And the other one is simply a white wall. All the other walls are actually white. Visitors will enter the room through one of these. I don't have anything to point, but you can see one of these. I don't know that I can walk. One of these 2 rooms. So you could either enter this way or that way. So you are in 2 separated rooms, separated by this acoustic glass, insulating, right? So the audience in a room then will see the audience in the other, but is isolated from it acoustically. They will also see themselves and the other audience reflected in the mirror. Graham say about this work that the Venice Biennale and others art fairs today function very much like 19th century world fairs, where each country is represented by a pavilion, but the art is now the commodity. In Venice, he says he attempted to upset this system by turning the audience itself into the exhibit. Visitors to the pavilion will see themselves, seeing themselves. They have become the commodity. The fact, and those are some pictures again of these visitors seeing themselves and seeing others in the pavilion. The fact recalls, I think, that of Mies van der Rohe Barcelona pavilion of 1929, where visitors also used to see themselves reflected in the dark glass with the clouds, the sky, and the trees appearing behind them. A local journalist from Barcelona, it's also very interesting that this pavilion that became known as the most important monument of modern architecture was in fact not seen by very many people. Among other things, it was 1929, so not exactly a year to go around doing tourism, but even the journalists that were sent to the exhibition didn't record it, didn't recognize it as architecture, didn't see it. As you will see later, it's in a very prominent position in the fair, but nobody saw it, right? So it's only a local journalist, no relation with architecture, that makes the following remark in the newspaper, which I think is extraordinary. He says that there is this mysterious pavilion, because he says a person standing in front of one of those glasses sees himself reflected as if by a mirror. But if he moves behind them, then he sees the exterior perfectly. Not all visitors notice this curious particularity whose cause remains ignored. Right? And I think it's absolutely necessary to go back to these kinds of naive and early spontaneous statements to understand the surprise that glass architecture produced in 1929, something that perhaps a generation grown up around Hilton International hotels, as Alison Smithson put it, will have difficulty imagining. In any case, Mies and Graham, I think, are linked by the idea of the pavilion. When commissioned to build the German pavilion for the International Exhibition of Barcelona in 1929, Mies asked the Ministry of Foreign Affairs what was to be exhibited. That's a normal question for an architect. What is this for? What is the function of this building? An artist, of course, never will ask this question. But this is the interesting thing. The answer was nothing will be exhibited, he was told. The pavilion itself is the exhibit, right? So it was precisely in the absence of a traditional program that Mies was able to somehow bring his work to a new level, and one of the most important structures of modern architecture emerged. But also what is interesting that is in the absence of this program, the Barcelona pavilion became in a way an exhibit about exhibition. All it exhibited in a way was a new way of looking. So in both Mies and Dan Graham pavilion, the visitors are themselves on display. Instead of contemplating discrete objects, whether the artworks or the commodities, both things are, of course, in Dan Graham's concept completely confused with each other, they see themselves in the space of the exhibition. The work is simply a space in which people encounter themselves then, a space of reflection. Dan Graham is obviously a dedicated student of architecture, both contemporary and historical. You have to go to his apartment. It's unbelievable the amount of books he has on architecture, and wherever he is, anywhere in the world, he insists on being taken to see certain building. He knows more about architecture than many historians of architecture, and definitely many architects. But of all these architects that he's fascinated with, Mies is really the architect that he really identifies with more, the one that he has influenced more his work. Yet what Dan learned from Mies is not simply the look of Mies in the sense of a reproducible visual style, but precisely Mies' way of exposing the very act of looking, the new ways in which we look both at ourselves and at the world. Mies' sense then of architecture as a vision machine. From the Venice Biennale installation of Dan Graham that you can see here, he steadily elaborated on a reflection on vision itself in an ongoing series of pavilions that deploy architecture as an optical instrument. By now, Dan Graham has done like about more than 50 pavilions worldwide in a remarkable sustained test. In a sense, all of Graham's pavilions stay between the original kind of surprise of glass architecture, endlessly exploring the enigma that glass is actually not transparent. I mean, this is actually, by the way, the same thing that surprised Mies. When experimenting for his glass skyscraper of 1922, he built these glass models and planted them in the garden, in a garden in Berlin, and photographed them from many points of view before he arrived to the canonical images. But then he wrote about the fact that in the end, he was much more interested in the reflections, in how the play of reflections actually created more of an opaque than a transparent sense for glass. But also Dan Graham not only is interested in still in this kind of enigma of the transparency reflection, but he takes Mies' quest into another dimension, seeing the place of reflections in psychological, sexual, and even economic terms. He forces the viewer to become implicated in these questions. For example, in this space, in public space, two audiences in the Venice Biennale, visitors had to agree beforehand to spend 10 minutes in the space when they enter the room. So there is, again, like in the story of Anaïs, some kind of a contract. There is a contrast between the artist and the visitor. The traditional viewer of the artwork has been turned first into a visitor of the architecture, and then into a spectator of a performance in which he or she is implicated. All they see, all the visitors see, is themselves being seen by others, an erotic gaze then superimposed on a narcissistic gaze. It is as if Dan Graham wanted to capture the very complications in the very act of looking. But the question for me is, why does he need architecture to intensify the effect that he had already been exploring repeatedly in video work since the early 70s? For example, you have this work here of 1970, 1972, Body Press, for example, where a naked couple, actually is himself and a friend, film each other with two cameras inside this mirror cylinder, capturing both themselves and the very act of capturing. But the viewers of the work couldn't enter the cylinder, and this is important. Likewise, in another work of this moment, this one, to consciousness projection of 1972 too. A woman, as you can see in the picture, concentrates on her image in the camera, right? Where the filmmaker, the cameraman, concentrates on her image in the camera. The audience watches the scene, but again, as with the body press, they cannot enter the space, they cannot participate in the performance. In public space to audiences, architecture becomes the optical instrument and the viewer becomes the performer. That is, what is radical about this work, what is completely different from the early works, is that he does away with any cameras. There are no videos, there is no more instruments, but the architecture is operating in exactly the same way. It's operating precisely as an optical instrument, and the viewer has become the performer. The key step in making this work architectural is, of course, the introduction of the two doors. The work is no longer in a space, the work is a space that has to be entered, or more precisely, it becomes work when entered. It doesn't exist as an artwork until people enter the space. The observer is producing the effect. Architecture is used to undermine the gallery system with its systematic separation of viewer and work. And yet, Dan Graham felt that the undermining in this apparently very successful work that was written about everywhere didn't go far enough, and started to go deeper and deeper into the architectural world. And this is what exactly he says about this work and why he is disappointed in the end with this groundbreaking piece, according to many critics. He says, after the Venice Biennale, I realized the trap in that work, which seemed to be very successful, was that it was inside the white cube of a gallery. So I wonder what will happen if I took one wall away and made it into a window. Then immediately you will have something that was both architecture and exhibition space. This corresponded to a group of walls that I researched or had physically seen often done by architects, such as the Rietveld sculpture Pavilion by the Otterlo Kroller-Müller Museum, or demonstration pavilions of new architecture for temporary exhibitions. He doesn't say which ones, but you can imagine, no? The Springwood Pavilion of Le Corbusier in the 1925 exhibition in Paris, or the Melnikov Pavilion in the same exhibition, etc. So what he calls demonstration pavilion of new architecture for temporary exhibitions. So I was thinking again about exhibiting architectural models as art. This is an area that has become important during constructivism, but was not really dealt with in minimal art. So dissatisfied basically with the fact that the pavilion in Venice was still a gallery space with a wide wall, he moved the focus of his work to the suburbs, and this is what he does, alteration to a suburban house, replacing the subject of the gallery with a suburban tract house with a facade that has been replaced by a glass wall. So this is alteration to a suburban house of 1978, which is basically a house split in two, right? The same format, therefore, of public space to audiences of the Venice Biennale, except the audience now are no longer the two sections of the artwork, but the family, the supposed family inside the suburban house and the passerby in the street. Alteration makes visible the optical structure of suburban life. Through the mirror, there is a mirror which slashes the house in half, lengthwise, in the middle. Visitors and passersby then will see themselves inside the house, moving around the virtual living room with the landscape of the suburbs, the street, the sidewalks, the lawn, and the neighboring houses behind them. They will see themselves in an interior, but also in an exterior, which has been now been made part of the interior. That is, because of the reflection of the mirror, the outside, as you can see, is already part of the inside. On the other side of the glass wall, inhabitants of alteration will see themselves outside in the street reflected in the mirror. So passerby and inhabitants then are sharing this kind of convoluted space of the mirror. Tract housing is, according to Dan Graham, the new city. It is very much unlike the turn of the century city, and these are, of course, Levy towns for $25 down in this beautiful photograph in Life magazine where the couple is there with the television, which is of course like the central, and all the elements of the house around it, right? All the appliances, etc. So if it's according to Dram, the suburb or tract housing is the new city, as I say, this is completely different of the early 20th century city, which according to Walter Benjamin, there will be this flaneur that will be hiding precisely in the space of the city while contemplating its spectacle. But in the suburbs, the situation has been reversed. The pedestrian is now really the person who is most exposed, scrutinized by all these eyes behind every window, eyes that you do not see, and they don't even need to be there to be felt, right? I mean, this is reminds me of Jean-Paul Sartre when he talks about the fact that a window is a window if you feel already, if you feel yourself watched. If a window becomes an eye, if you see yourself being watched, regardless of whether there is someone behind it or not. In Graham's alteration, through the device of the mirror, this experience is precisely double. I can see myself inside the living room of the house that I am walking past. I have become as much part of the living room as the furniture. I am the object of my own surveillance. I look in and I see myself looking out. Right? So as a pedestrian, you look into the house, but through the device of the mirror, you see yourself looking out. With alteration, with other projects like video projection outside the home of 1978, and with the clinic for a suburban site of 1978, and cinema of 1981, then Dan Graham adopted the architectural model as the medium for his intervention. And in fact, some of these projects are an explicit homage to particular architects. Clearly, alteration, he says, refers to the glass houses of Mies, the Farnsworth house of Mies van der Rohe of 1949, and Johnson's house, also the glass house of 1949 as well. Cinema is both an homage and an inversion of the Cineac of Duker in Amsterdam, whose work, Duker work, Dan Graham is also a great admirer. Duker's Cineac was also in a street corner and had glass walls on two sides, offering views of the projection room and the audience to the passers-by in the street. In cinema, Graham puts two-way mirrors glasses between the audience and the film and the people on the street. Depending on which side is most illuminated, both sets of viewers will see the viewers in the other space and see themselves also looking. The two-way mirror movie screen likewise allows the outside audience to look through the image and see those watching the film. And when the lights of the film go on at the end of the film, the inside audience then can see themselves reflected in this mirror. So it becomes, in a way, it's like the audience all of a sudden becomes the movie once the film is finished. But despite also the success of these models that were actually quite written about and explored by many critics, Dan Graham continued to be dissatisfied. He didn't think it was architecture enough. So 6 years later, he returns, after 6 years later, after the Venice Biennale, he returns precisely to the idea of the pavilion. This is the first pavilion that he did after all this time, the two adjacent pavilions, which is a pair of freestanding structures made of mirror reflective glass, and that were first shown in Venice in 1978, and then were built for Documenta. It's not an accident, again, that they were built precisely for another art fair, Documenta 7 in 1981. So if public space to audience had only one interface, that acoustic plane between the two separated rooms, in two adjacent pavilions, the interface are now multiple. The four sides of each of the two enterable pavilions were made of two mirror glass. One of the pavilions had a transparent glass ceiling, while the ceiling in the other one was opaque. The pavilion whose ceiling is opaque is more reflected in the outside and transparent on the inside, and the other pavilion flooded with light from above shifts its degree of transparency or reflection depending on the hour of the day and the amount of sun and clouds. The position of the pavilions next to each other also exponentially multiply the mirroring effect. Significantly also, the work has now moved to the landscape. So from the gallery now to the landscape. Dan Graham precisely understands his pavilions to be in explicit dialogue with a long history of architectural pavilion. He often refers, for example, to the primitive hut of Loggier in the mid-18th century, to the 19th century gazebo in a park, to the national pavilions in the exhibitions of commodities that we talk about in the international fairs of the 19th century, to the 20th century pavilions of modern architecture for expositions and international fairs, and even to bus stops and telephone booths. To put it in his own words, his pavilions, he says, retrace the history of the pavilion as a type of architecture from the Rococo pavilion in the Prince estate to the 19th century Belvedere, from the urban bus shelter to the pavilions presented in temporary exhibitions like the Miss Barcelona pavilion. So he's always going back to Miss, as you can see. And here you see this beautiful pavilion, mirror pavilion, this Rococo pavilion in Munich of 1734. By focusing on pavilions, Graham's work is not just connected to architecture, but it's precisely connected to that part of architecture you can see it constitutes the leading edge of architectural discourse. In many ways, you can see that the most extreme, you can say that the most extreme and influential proposals in the history of architecture took place precisely in the context of temporary exhibition. There were pavilions in the context of temporary exhibition. And again, it's important here to insist that what is understood by a pavilion, right, is not precisely a container for architecture, a container for art, but it's a form of art, kind of an experiment again, in the sense that the Barcelona pavilion was an experiment. But again, thinking about this long history of pavilions in modern architecture, we can go back to the burnt out glass pavilion in the Bourbon exhibition in Cologne of 1914. Here is under construction, and here L'Esprit Nouveau pavilion in Paris of 1925. Here being actually under construction too, with this pair of Japanese women looking on, and of course the Benlikov pavilion in the same exhibition in Paris. Again, these are some of the most spectacular experiments of modern architecture. Mies and Lily Reich Silk exhibition pavilion or cafe in Berlin of 1927, and of course their glass room in Stuttgart of 1927. Again, the glass room, and of course the Barcelona pavilion, his most famous pavilion. Then you can think about Le Corbusier Nestlé pavilion in Paris, Alvar Aalto Finnish pavilion in New York in the World's Fair of 1939, the pavilion of in Breda pavilion of 1952 by Baldessari, a pavilion that you see today and you may think is, I don't know, by Ben van Berkel or circa 1995. The patio and pavilion, of course, the famous pavilion of Alison and Peter Smithson with Eduardo Paolozzi and Nigel Henderson as part of the independent group exhibition. Here they are in front of the pavilion. You can think also about their house of the future, the house that they built as a one-to-one demonstration pavilion for the Daily Mail exhibition in 1956, and those are all images from the house of the future. So in every moment of the 20th century, there are all these pavilions that fundamentally change architecture. Here again, the Philippe pavilions of Le Corbusier and Xenakis under construction, or Buckminster Fuller Dome for the 1959 exhibition in Moscow, or the IBM, this fantastic egg pavilion, the IBM pavilion in the 1964 exhibition in New York, done by Saarinen with the Eames. Or you can think also about Van Eyck Pavilion of 1965. Or it doesn't matter, the orientation of the architecture pavilion seems to be like a weapon, something that is launched towards the future, marking a new direction. Again, Van Eyck. And then, of course, Fray Otto, the famous pavilion for the Expo in Montreal, etc. And here you have the Pepsi pavilion for the Expo 70 in Osaka by IT, Experiments in Art and Technology, a very influential pavilion, for example, on what later Diller and Escofidio will do in Switzerland, the Blur pavilion. Or think about Kopp Himmelblau, the Cloud, a prototype for future living, designed for Documenta 5 again. Or Aldo Rossi, El Teatrino del Mondo, which is a temporary structure, a temporary theater built for the Venice Biennale of 1979 to recall precisely the floating theaters of Venice in the 18th century popular during carnivals. At the end of the, this is of course the pavilion of Aldo Rossi in Venice, the Teatrino del Mondo, next to these fantastic churches. And at the end of the exhibition, the El Teatro del Mondo crossed the Adriatic Sea on its way to Dubrovnik. Here it's arriving in Dubrovnik. So it's always something in movement, something that is temporary, right? Where it was exhibited and finally dismantled. Well, this tradition of the pavilion as a site for architectural experimentation continues, of course, still strong into the 21st century with such mythical works as the project of Diller and Escofidio, the Blur building in Switzerland, a media pavilion for the Swiss Expo of 2002, now destroyed, like all these other pavilions that I saw, they are all destroyed. And of course, the series of pavilions that somehow spring up every year at the Serpentine Gallery, the Ito Pavilion, the Kulhans Pavilion, Sana's Pavilion, and on and on. Allison and Peter Smithson are among the architects that reflected precisely on the importance of the pavilion in modern architecture. They saw their House of the Future, commissioned for the Daily Mail, as I say, as a pavilion for the Ideal Home exhibition of 1956, following precisely the tradition of temporary pavilions as a site of architectural innovation. Like all exhibitions, Peter Smithson wrote, they live a life of a few weeks, but then they go on and on forever, like the Barcelona pavilion before it was reconstructed. So the temporary, paradoxically, turns out to be permanent. In fact, according to the Smithson, the reconstruction of the Barcelona pavilion in a way kills it, right? So they go on and on forever as long as they are not reconstructed. As always, the Smithsons position their work in a genealogy of 3 generations, each building upon and transforming the vision of a previous generation. In particular, they saw this house, the House of the Future, as an inheritor of the 20th century tradition, a 3rd generation extending the work of Le Corbusier in the Esprit Nouveau pavilion, for example, right? And in fact, the Smithson's pavilion in a way echoes Le Corbusier apartment, the pavilion, the Esprit Nouveau, which is a model apartment filling in with all the everyday objects to present a view of modern living, with the difference that the Smithsons will display and draw from the transient material of an ever-changing market. So found objects like the tonnage chair or the perfected generic wine glass give way in the Smithsons to imagine disposable objects and food packaging, like you can see here in this kind of airtight feast. And this is their son, Simon Smithson's looking into the fridge with this kind of great fur coat that Allison had designed for him. Allison, of course, was a very talented fashion designer herself. even when modern architecture was permanent, it somehow retained the mentality of the pavilion. Its modernity was conveyed in the sense that it could live just as easily as it had arrived, with every building conveying a lightweight, transitional feeling, even when actually built from heavy materials. So from, if Le Corbusier pilotis already created an image of an architecture walking on stilts, here today but gone tomorrow, with Archigram, we get a whole urban formations on the move, on projects like Walking City or Instant City. A whole city arrives and lives in one day, like a temporary fair or exhibition. The logic of the exhibition and the temporary pavilion in particular has then organized an entire century of architecture innovation. Exhibition pavilions in the 20th century, in fact, acted as sites for incubations of new forms of architecture that sometimes were so shockingly original, so new that they were not even recognized as architecture as well. As I said before, the Barcelona pavilion, which is widely understood in architectural work as the most influential building of the 20th century, the most important monument of the 20th century, was paradoxically seen by nobody at all. And this is despite its prominent position in the layout of the, it's up there, that little thing up there in the corner. But despite being in a very prominent position, as I say, even journalists sent by architectural magazines didn't, there it is, circle, didn't see it at all, and we have to rely on local journalists and people that didn't know anything about architecture to verify that actually it existed. All we see is the photographs. All we have of the pavilion is the photographs. It was only in the 1950s, and precisely in the aftermath of the 1947 Mies exhibition in the Museum of Modern Art, curated by Philip Johnson, that the pavilion burst into every architectural publication. Those are actually images by Charles Eames that was sent by Arts and Architecture to photograph the exhibition of Mies at the Museum of Modern Art. Actually great images. Right. So it was only in this context, after this exhibition, that the pavilion was hailed as the most beautiful building of the century. So a building that was only known through magazine images. It was dismantled, as I say, at the closing of the exhibition in Barcelona, and its fragments were somehow misplaced. In his return trip to Germany, became the most significant monument of modern architecture. Now here is Mies looking at his, not at the Farnsworth House rather than the Barcelona pavilion, in the very context of that exhibition, looking at his mother as if he had never seen it before. But anyway, what is crucial about the Barcelona pavilion then is that it was both real, a one-to-one construction that existed for a short time, and an image, a media construction. All we knew about it before its reconstruction in 1986 were precisely the photograph. It lived in these photographs. And this is, it is really important to understand this relationship between photographs and pavilion. It is the unique role of pavilions to fuse image and structure in this way. The pavilion is the key instrument for negotiating the relationship in that sense between image and physical structure. What is also curious is that the experiment of the Barcelona pavilion, like so many other experiments of temporary exhibitions, will in the end fall into different hands, as when in the 1985 Milan Triennale, OMA and Rem Koolhaas constructed their bodybuilding house, which is nothing else but a Barcelona pavilion bent to fit the structure of their allotted site in the exhibition building. This is what Rem Koolhaas writes about this project. By then, phobic about the duty to reveal, we decided to embody our resistance to an exhibit about in an exhibit about the exhibition. At the time, a clone of Mies pavilion was being built in Barcelona. How fundamentally did it differ from Disney? In the name of a higher authenticity, and these are the images of the reconstruction, we researched the true history of the pavilion after the closing of the 1929 World's Fair and collected whatever archaeological fragments it had left across Europe in its return journey. Like a Pompeian villa, those fragments were reassembled as far as possible to suggest the former whole, but with one inevitable inaccuracy, and those are the fragments, this imaginary story of the pavilion that he reconstructs, right? With one, he says, one inevitable inaccuracy. Since our side was curved, the pavilion had to be bent, end of the quote. So OMA's true history of the pavilion, these panels that I just saw, is actually a fantasy intended as an homage to the pavilion, but also to modern architecture under attack in those very years, in the 80s, as lifeless, empty, and puritanical. It has always been our conviction, Rem Koolhaas wrote, that modern architecture is an hedonistic movement, that its abstraction, rigor, and severity are in fact plots to create the most provocative settings for the experiment that is modern life. In the body building house, then the Barcelona pavilion becomes kind of inhabited with all these gymnasts, bodybuilders, and exercise equipment in a suprematist kind of explosion of projected images, lighting effects, and lasers. Mies minimalist statement becomes engorged with activities, and the reference, of course, multiplies. I think in many ways the project alludes, this project of the bodybuilding house alludes to this long tradition in architecture of, in a way, the bodybuilding house, from Marcel Breuer Piscator room in Berlin to Gropius's gym in an apartment in the Berlin exhibition, to Richard Docker's terrace in the roof of the Weissenhof, for example, to the pool of Mariette Stevens' house in Villa-Noëls, to even this fantastic image of the Tugendhat house, who was abandoned during the German occupation of Czechoslovakia. And when the communist bureaucrats took over the house, they transformed it into a gym for handicapped children. So modern architecture was understood even by communist bureaucrats that didn't necessarily know the history of this house, understood unproblematically as medical and exercise equipment. So in a way, OMA then takes modern architecture dream of a healthy body to a new level. And this is actually typical also of pavilions and experimentations in exhibition, because they always become collective in the end. Other architects pick up on the idea, work on them, and somehow are responded to by other architects. And this is what architectural discourse, you can say, is all about. These are images actually that I found in the office of REM, which are photographs of this structure. I don't know exactly what the context is, but there seems to have been some idea of film that they would have happened in this structure, but they've never been published, I don't think. It was kind of weird. I don't know exactly what's going on, but yeah. The rebuilding of the Barcelona pavilion is itself an important part of the story of pavilions, where many of Mies' buildings have been destroyed. The temporary exhibition pavilion has become such a central monument in architectural culture that it was reconstructed in 1987 on the original exhibition as a kind of simulacra. The same thing, by the way, happened to Le Corbusier's Prix Nouveau pavilion, which in 1977, again, a replica was built in a park in Bologna after practically more than 50 years that the pavilion had been destroyed. As Peter Smithson wrote, to visit it is to be reminded that an architect always needs to have his pots and pans and his views of nature ready in case he's asked. Right? To some extent, as I said before, the reconstruction interferes with the discourse. Many exhibition experiments gain their force precisely by disappearing. They inhabit the space of photography precisely, of publications, of memory, of fantasy. The lack of a specific client or a site gives them a permanent role. Since they are not so pinned down, they remain open to speculation. Reconstruction in a way fixes them, it not finishes them. The full force of the pavilion is always the possibility that it will leave as abruptly as it arrived. And I think the encounter with an object that is about to leave is fundamentally different. The thought that you may not be able to return to it makes the experience elusive, even romantic. Afterwards, it becomes unclear what happened, and it is this lack of clarity that opens up new horizons. Pavilions, in a way, even the name itself, to finish, may have something to say about this, because pavilion, in fact, etymologically comes from a pavilion, the French word for butterfly, when the sides of open-lighted, lightweight nomadic tent, such as this Tibetan tent, were associated with the wings of a butterfly. The pavilion then is that which arrives, fluttering in from an unknown place, a pure image in flight, hovering for a moment, touching down, and standing there with its full image exposed before fluttering away again, leaving everything changed in its wake. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beatriz. So I know that we started a little bit late, but we do now have time for questions. So if you want to put your hand up, and myself and my colleague will run round with the microphone if you have any points or comments you want to make. I mean, for my part, I think the most immediate thing that came to mind was a camera obscura, yes, from a sort of photographic perspective, and this kind of this sort of very much this awareness of the outside world from the inside rather than from the outside, and the sort of difference, I suppose, between that and a kind of mirror, but also this sort of absolute impossibility of reaching that which you're looking at as well, which has got this sort of dialogue with mirrors, windows, and the lens, I suppose, as well. But I don't know if you want to
No, I completely agree. I mean, that's in a way what I was trying to say at the beginning, that Dangram, in a way, makes us inhabit that space, right? The space of the camera. And also, in many ways, you can also turn it around and think about modern architecture itself as a machine to see. In many ways, what modern architecture offers is a different view of the world. So if you can think about the structure itself of, let's say, any of these pavilions, what they offer is another way of framing the world. I mean, in Le Corbusier, for example, it's very symptomatic when he argues, for example, for the horizontal window as the most important, or one of the most important elements of modern architecture. He got into a lot of trouble precisely with his master, Auguste Perret, who accuses Le Corbusier very publicly in the pages of the most important newspaper of Paris at the time, and Le Corbusier was obviously devastated by this attack, that Le Corbusier architecture is not architecture at all. And then the argument focused very quickly on the question of the window, right? And it's very explicit that the architecture of Le Corbusier is not architecture at all, because the horizontal window frames a view of the landscape which is not complete. But then you say to yourself, but an image that you see from of the outside world from a window is never complete. But then he goes on, and then you understand. He says in a French window, and he describes this man standing up and holding the window. This obviously erected man has a perspectival view of the world. He doesn't use the word perspectival, but he says that you have view of the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, where he says the Le Corbusier window cuts out from view that which is most interesting, which is the foreground and the background, leaving you only with the middle ground, therefore leaving you basically with a flat image of the landscape, which of course is very much related to cinema and the interest that Le Corbusier had at that time with cinema. But there in that argument, you can see what I mean in the when I talk about architecture as a machine, to see a complete different paradigm has been developed with Le Corbusier's architecture, and Perret, even if he was, of course, himself a very innovative architect that has used concrete, will in a way have drawn the line there, right? This is not architecture anymore, right? Because I don't have a perspectival view of the world.
There's a really great interview with Dan Graham where he talks about his early work in the mid-'60s. And he had a gallery for a while. And the interviewer said, did many people actually go to that gallery? He said no, but what really mattered was that the right critics came and everything was photographed really well.
Yeah.
So it shows from very early on he's got a very sophisticated, not cynical, but let's call it a pragmatic understanding about publicity.
Right.
And as his career develops, he makes these site-specific works in which every critic and writer tells you how site-specific they are, and they usually tell you with the accompaniment of a perfectly rectangular, flat image of the kind you've shown us this evening. So I wonder if you could say something about Dan Graham as a phenomenon of art history and architectural history, and Dan Graham's work, which I think is probably something different, but maybe they can't be separated anymore.
Right, right. Well, in a way, I think this remark, for me, I will also relate it to his interest and his understanding of architecture, because architecture is that way too. I mean, art is your business unless you have an art dealer and a gallery. But architecture enters architecture discourse precisely through photography and the architectural magazine. Otherwise, it's a building that you pass in the street, but it has entered architecture with a capital A. It has entered the discourse only when it's published, when it's written about by a critic. So architects are extremely conscious about this, particularly since the existence of photography and architectural publications. And in many ways, these temporary pavilions, these temporary structures are very significant of that situation, very much related to what Dan Graham say about his gallery. Doesn't matter that the pavilion of Barcelona was seen by nobody, not even by people that actually should have seen it, right? Because they were there, because they were journalists from noted architectural magazines, but they couldn't see it, they were not ready to see it. They will be ready in 1950 when the exhibition of Mies took place. It took them 20 years more to get to that point. But what was circulated in the meantime and made possible the figure of Mies to be recognized was precisely the photographs that he himself actually controlled very much, only certain drawings, or only 5 or 6 photographs. I had an undergraduate student that did a thesis on the pavilion. It was unbelievable, the very few photographs and the very few documents of that pavilion, how it could be constructed as the most important monument of the 20th century on the basis of basically 4 or 5 images.
I think actually the most important thing that Dan said about running that gallery was the shows that they put on of Dan Flavin. Because by making the object into the source of light, it in effect produced a sort of gestalt reversal, in as much as the principal object of attention was thrown back onto the visitors themselves, and who couldn't help but notice each other because of the light that was thrown. It's very hard to stare into a neon strip light. At the same time, the neon strip lights reconfigured the phenomenal shape of the gallery, and made moving around in that gallery, in a sense, the main business of being there. Since Dan was sat there all day watching this, it became, in effect, an object lesson and a subject lesson, as it were, in the future of his work.
Right. Fascinating. I didn't realize that. That's really. I mean, it ties it all together with the other world, with the public space to audience, etc., with the visitor becoming part of the work.
I think perhaps we're all a little bit hot in this room.
Yeah, it is.
So it might be time, since we started a little bit late as well, to finish there. But thank you all for coming, and thank you very much.
Thank you.